All right, we'll get into chapters 8 and 9 here. These slide decks are a little shorter. Some of the information, it's a little bit more of information to kind of read through rather than me just kind of dictating some of the text-heavy slides. So these would be ones in person, trim these up a little bit. But like I said, since I haven't been using the textbook here, kind of put in more information, more text on the slides than normal. So they're a little bit more, these chapters a little bit, slide decks for these chapters are a little bit more of the read-through type. I don't want to just read them verbatim for you guys. I don't think that would be helpful. So rather, we're going to go through, hit some of the high points here and kind of explain some of the concepts. So this one, able to double up with these two here, be a little bit more effective and shorter as well. So chapter 8 starts us off here with forging significant change. And we just kind of run through how organizations across industries and then specifically into sport have recognized that, hey, we can't keep doing business as usual like we had throughout the 21st century and like we had for the past 20, 30, 40 years. We've got to change. Innovation's kind of the name of the game. And organizational change, specifically here, is part of that. And how we foster change, how we get into it, it is complex, it's messy, but again, one of the key things that you've heard me say, as long as you've been watching these videos consistently, is that leaders are agents of change. And we kind of form the basis of that a little bit more in depth here in this chapter. So organizations, specifically sport ones, can experience three different types of change. We can go into developmental, transitional, or transformational. Organizational change that happens naturally, growth occurs on its own and would take place is referred to as that developmental change. Organization that slowly evolves moves through most common change, which is transitional change, to improve the current state gradually. So it's not the shock and awe. This is something that takes a little bit more time, as well as really focuses on kind of the gradual change. And usually this one, depending on the industry and the change that's occurring, we might see less turnover. Then we see transformational change efforts. This is the focus of our current chapter for a bit. Question the current assumptions and reject the current paradigm. This is a little bit more immediate. So this doesn't happen slowly over time. Rather, this is change that happens a little bit quicker. So whether we approach change or need change as an organization broadly or just in a narrow scope, it pretty much happens because of internal and or external pressures. We realize that something is an impetus for us to have to change, to adapt, to keep up with competitors, to achieve our own goals. Whatever the case is there. Could be a laundry list. We could spend an hour talking about all the different factors and pressures that would affect organizational change and cause it. When a change is employed to avoid a crisis, that's when we know we're approaching a proactive change. So trying to avoid something, trying to avoid falling off from our perch. Maybe if we're a leader in the industry, we see some kind of crisis happening or some kind of issue happening within the industry or the organization. Then when change is response to a situation, that's when we're reactive change. So that's pretty straightforward there. Now within change, once it's engaged or once we're talking about trying to do it, we pretty much have this tug of war within an organization. And it's this resistance versus acceptance. And there's pros and cons to both. Ideally, there's a little bit of both within every change, because then that means that we're taking it seriously, that we're taking in broad aspects of different views. But we don't want to be bogged down in one or the other. We don't want everything and everybody to resist the change, because it'll never happen, or it'll happen much more slowly than we probably need it to. And we might have increased risk of turnover and burning bridges then. But we also probably don't want acceptance right off the bat 100% either, because then that shows that maybe we're not thinking of all the angles. Maybe we've got an organization or a team that's been fallen victim to groupthink. It could also mean that the acceptance happens so quickly that people just, they're afraid to voice their opinions or to challenge some of the change. And so that may be a red flag that our organizational culture is not as healthy as we think it is. So then we'll dive into some of the aspects of both here. Resistance itself is a tri-dimensional negative attitude towards change. So again, some of it can be healthy, but too much of it will pretty much halt the whole process as well. So we don't want this to be too much and have too many people resisting the change here. But those three dimensions and negative attitudes are affective, behavioral, and cognitive components. So some sources of resistance can stem from stakeholders' emotions, employee emotions, might be a little bit more directly on influence behaviors, and others may also influence what stakeholders think about the change. So it's this boiling pot of all three different kinds of dimensions and attitudes here. And a lot of it stems from those emotions. People are naturally usually resistant to change, as well as why we're being influenced to change can be disruptive as well. And then we trickle that down into talking to others, and it can be troublesome. So some of the reasons, personality dispositions can certainly play a role. Neuroticism also represents individual differences in adjustment and emotional stability. And I would also argue that organizational tenure can be part of it as well. Those that have been tenured longer at an organization tend to risk being more resistant to change. They don't want to change. They don't want to necessarily be as innovative or literally change how they do their jobs or open to ideas. And sometimes that can be a positive because they can shepherd in the organizational history throughout the change process and keep some of the grounded approach that made the organization successful in the first place. But other times it can actually be a turnoff for those that are actually trying to enact the change and explore the options and make the change actually happen as well. Not only that, but depending on the level of leadership that some of those folks are at, if they're resistant to change, then that can trickle down into their teams or departments and negatively affect other employees trying to voice different opinions and different ideas as well. And that usually leads to a lower job satisfaction, turnover, all those kinds of things. Individuals specifically that are high in neuroticism experience negative emotions attached to the change, which can be anything from anxiety, depression, hostility, impulsiveness, and vulnerability as well. And again, that can kind of trickle through some of the different aspects of an organization and department. Outside of the personality aspect, stakeholders can also be resistant because it impacts them professionally and personally. And this is pretty straightforward. If we're talking about our jobs, our organization, we've probably invested a lot of time, a lot of our personal and professional development through the organization. So how that change is going to affect that can be scary. Stakeholders' views can often depend on how they predict their own work and their own situations will change. And again, this kind of gets a little bit into that perception. Our own perception becomes our own reality a little bit as well. So we have to, if their views are incorrect or false, we have to work that much harder to break those down and get them to see the actual change, the actual outcomes as well. And that's where leaders really need to communicate the change effectively, clearly, and concisely. On the flip side, there'll be less resistance if stakeholders' interests are met. And if we have them and bring them to the table and illustrate and show and have them voice their opinions and concerns and integrate that into the change and see how they'll actually benefit from the change, then that speeds up the process of negating some resistance and actually can increase the rate of acceptance. And stakeholders might have had prior negative experience with organizational change, and that could affect how they view all organizational change, and also indications that stakeholders can resist change if they believe that the values are being espoused through organizational change conflict with their own personal values. So if we're trying to change the full culture and everything, if it's a full-on organizational change, then that might run counter to some of those personal beliefs and values. Again, leadership and organizational culture need to pretty much go level by level across organization or down an organization, communicating the change, getting that buy-in, getting key stakeholders to buy in at each level, and then work through it. Organizational change is a key aspect of organizational culture and vice versa. I usually like to describe these as kind of a uh, symbiote relationship within one another. They can kind of be nestled in within each other when they're going through it. Organizational culture is going to be shaped by the change, and the change is going to be shaped by the culture. Culture specifically is defined as a set of shared, usually implicit assumptions that a group holds and determines basically how it perceives, thinks about, and reacts to various environments specific to that organization. That's why, if we've depending on our playing experience for athletics or work experience, that's why no two organization cultures are necessarily the same, especially for jumping from industry to industry. Sometimes the industry culture affects the org culture. If we think about some examples like Google and just some of the innovation and the change and the culture within Google and on their campuses and workplaces, it's quite fascinating compared to the typical 9 to 5 cubicle, punch in, punch out, make a bunch of sales calls kind of culture. It's very, very different. Again, leaders are those agents of change agents, and they have to basically take a look at some of the different environmental constraints when they're trying to lead it. Change agents have to pay attention to resources and facilities, internal politics, as well as change agents within sport organizations can face that resistance based on history and tradition. Sports probably one of the industries most rooted in history and tradition, and so anything that tries to buck that trend or buck that history a little bit can be a little troublesome. Next, we see ambivalence, and this basically just suggests that it can actually be the most prevalent initial type of response among stakeholders here. And this just means that it's a mixed evaluations or motives that individuals experience within and with respect to attitude objects in their social environments. And so this kind of plays a role into the idea, issue, object of an employee and their feeling or belief and how it relates to the change itself or the organization in its current static state before the change. This gets a little bit into participative and autocratic leadership. This kind of goes back to that foundational chapter early on, and this just gets into some of the leadership approaches that can help stimulate change a little more effectively and quicker, and also reassure employees and other stakeholders of those positive outcomes by bringing them to the table, by bringing them into the discussion and making sure that their voices are heard. Then next, we've got the stairway to change. You might be familiar with, and if not, then one of the ones that you would be familiar with in future classes or enacting change would be Cotter's 8-step change model here. This is one of the more common ones that's out there in existence, and we'll get into a few of these, but just kind of tweaked specific for sport. So we'll actually have a few more steps in the following slides that branch these off. But we can kind of see how these, we start at the bottom with number one, creating that urgency, building that coalition, that buy-in. We've got to create that vision, hopefully with that input from key stakeholders. Communicate it, empower, get the quick wins. Small, quick wins help speed along change and help knock down resistance even further. And we can build on that, and then we embed that over time. So again, we can hopefully see that this is not an overnight thing. This takes time, takes a lot of effort, especially if leaders are really enacting the change and they've got to change their own beliefs, their own ways of approaching it here. That is an internal struggle for the leader themselves too. That needs to be taken into consideration. Not all leaders that are guiding and shepherding an organization or team through change may believe fully in the change themselves. So that could take some time for them to get over and really kind of separate their own personal beliefs with what might be best for the organization. So our change implementation steps here. First, again, it just kind of goes into change agents in the sport organization have to evaluate and analyze that organization, determine what that impetus is for the change in the first place. Second, stakeholders in the organization should have input into that shared vision and also understand why we're changing, what the implications are. Third, have to take a look at the organizational history and traditions and see how those might carry over or which aspects may need to change, may need to be left behind. Next, we see those agents of change who kind of create that sense of urgency, that need for the action, and communicate it. And then the strong leaders in the fifth step here need to envision and guide that change and foster through it. This takes into consideration, or needs to take into consideration, talking with employees as well, talking with stakeholders, working with those individuals throughout the process here, especially those that are resistant. We don't want to necessarily just fire them right off the bat. We want to give them some time to work through the change, have their voices heard, all of that as well. And then 6, we see, again, the broad-based support for that transformational change throughout the organization needs to be obtained. That way now we start to hit on some of those quick victories, small victories. And then 7th here, the last slide for this section, we see the create an actual implementation plan, enable those structures to be developed, and again also have to pay attention and communicate with everybody else throughout the organization, especially those at other levels or departments that are guiding the change. Then lastly, I have to reinforce and evaluate the change. The leaders need to do this and kind of lead by example again. So again, this is not an easy process. This is probably one of the hardest processes to go through as a leader. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of ambition, and ranks up there with pretty much starting a new organization in difficulty level. It's easy to come in when things are running smoothly, you don't have to change much or anything substantial. But CEOs, general managers, team owners, coaches. I remember as a sales manager going through and implementing some changes in the organization back then. Some of that conflicted with what I viewed as where the organization should go. And at that point, I was also the most tenured person in the organization. And so there was a lot of internal conflicts that I had to kind of wrestle with, talk through the director, talk through my sales team, and work through as well. So again, it's a lot of micro, macro factors for the organization and for the people involved too. So that'll be Chapter 8. We'll get into Chapter 9 here in a second, so if you'd like to pause or transfer over to the slides here, that would be a good time. We'll get into Chapter 9, Fostering Innovation. Innovation piggybacks off of change, and so part of the reason why I wanted to keep these two together is these usually and hopefully can kind of go hand in hand, and hopefully that'll help with our understanding of it as well. Commonly, one of the definitions for innovation is any idea, practice, material, artifact that's perceived to be new by a relevant unit of adoption. So this basically just is saying that innovation is anything that's new, way of doing things, could be new software, new computers, new technology, new processes, new standards, whatever. It can be dubbed innovation to some extent. So one thing I want you to think about throughout this chapter, and even goes into a little bit of our leader profile assignment too, and what are some of the innovations that you've seen or can think of in sport or in sport organizations, and maybe with some of the leaders that you're doing in your projects, what role have those leaders had in that innovation or in the change, from piggybacking off the previous chapter as well. So just some food for thought, and some of those answers could add some really nice and interesting depth to those assignments, as well as to kind of get us thinking a little bit more deeply about things too. Further, innovation has kind of been refined in its definition. Now we see that it's also a multi-stage process, just like leadership is, just like change is as well, where organizations transform ideas into those new improved products, services, processes, whatever it is that they're doing, to basically advance, compete, and differentiate themselves successfully. Some historical grounding. Innovativeness is one of the main streams of research in innovation studies, and we also see this really starting to branch off into sports studies as well. I think it's an area ripe for sport-specific research, so this could be something if you're interested in potentially pursuing PhD or getting more involved in the research side. This one could really benefit from more attention from folks that are interested in it. Researchers have already started to identify various determinants that help an organization be innovative. and we'll dive into some of those as well. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this, a lot of the information, specifically in these Chapter 9 slides, is text heavy in lieu of not going along with the book. So again, I won't read it verbatim, but I do encourage you to make sure you read through those slides because they do have key definitions and key points, just like we would in an article or in a chapter as well. So this is a little bit more of a FYI kind of aspect here. Some of those determinants that have been found already, organizational ones, organizational determinants, relate to that internal environment, including structure, hierarchy, the organizational culture. I talked a little bit about with the organizational change, the size and complexity of the organization. So how innovative can we be? The bigger we are, can we be more innovative? The smaller we are, can we risk being innovative? Well, there's no simple answer. It depends. It depends on, again, a lot of the culture and all that complexity. If we're already a complex organization, pushing the innovative agenda quickly could lead to some issues. But if we take a slower approach, maybe we can integrate things into our organization more easily. Next, we also see environmental determinants, and so this is what happens and exists outside of the organization. This would be a greater society, political, socio-cultural, economic, basically what's going on with the world or the country or the community that we're operating in. And this could facilitate innovation, or it could also act as barriers. We can also think of this as some of the legal issues or laws that may preclude or make it a little bit more difficult, or could facilitate innovation. So again, it just kind of depends on what the innovation is. But environmental are external. So an easy way to differentiate that, both environmental and external start with E, so that kind of links them together there. The next, we've got managerial determinants. This is basically just a way that leadership is taken into account as a critical element to foster innovation. Leaders in the organization tend to have the opportunity to offer support, guidance, to either help or dissuade innovation, depending on a developed proposal, depending on who's putting forth the idea, so they can facilitate some of those resources and some of the charisma behind it. Further, we see the managerial demographics are also a key determinant. And that includes age, level, amount of education, something that might have some weight in different organizations, as qualifications as well. Could look at education, certifications, that tenure in the organization. Mentioned a few minutes ago with the organizational change, how tenure in the organization can be a factor in that. Same thing with innovation as well. Somebody who's been there longer, depends. If they don't have a history of being innovative, then that kind of tells us that they probably won't be in the future. But somebody who's been there a while and has been continually innovative, then they might push for it more. And same thing with somebody who's newer. Maybe they're viewed as kind of being the new innovative person with a different perspective as well. Next, we see leadership for innovation tends to rest with an individual who's referred to as an innovative or innovation champion. So again, somebody who's really got a champion a cause, just like anything else in an organization. We need at least one individual or several who can step up into these positions. We often think of leadership support for innovation happening top down, and that's partly true. It could also be from a down up approach, depending on where the innovative idea is coming from and depending on where the support comes from. Organizational determinants here also go from innovation can arise from that bottom-up aspect and can be fostered and developed within the organization through this different structures and cultures that promote it. So again, something that kind of comes to mind is the idea within Google, for example, that anybody can have the answer to a problem. It doesn't necessarily have to come from a leader or a committee or a new way of thinking it. They've got the resources, they're encouraged, they've got the time built into their allotted work time to go through innovative projects and see them through and see if they can work and fix it. So that's a culture, that's an organization with that culture embedded of innovation pretty heavily. In sport, we see sometimes they're proposed, initiated by boundary spanners, coaches, customers, volunteers. Boundary spanners really just a fancy word to say that members or quasi-members that are involved in different domains could work in the private sector, could volunteer, could be part of a non-for-profit club, and they bring ideas into an organization. So just new ways of thinking. One of the more famous ones would be Billy Beane, for example, with Moneyball and the Oakland Athletics, and bringing in that analytical approach. He would certainly be a boundary spanner when he first did that. They're also important sources of information, and individuals can also impact different sectors depending on what the innovation is and what their knowledge and expertise are as well. Further information here, some of the environmental aspects and specifically environmental determinants. And this just states that innovation develops from pressures and opportunities outside of the environment. So, providing that impetus for the innovation externally. Continuing along with there, so again, a lot of that kind of gets a little bit repetitive, some of the demographics and things like that. Just instead of focusing on the organization, now we're focusing in society. So instead of age or tenure of people in the organization, we now focus on the aging of the population, tenure of population in our community, for example. So in closing here, we kind of hit on innovation a bit. This piggybacks a little bit off of our readings as well, so some of this should look a little familiar, as well as hopefully gets us going a little bit as far as thinking future trends and future organizations and roles that we might want to work with in the sport industry too.